My name is Margaret Turner, though everyone has always called me Maggie. I am 69 years old now, and I have lived through enough loss to understand that grief leaves marks deeper than wrinkles ever could. But even still, there is one day that carved the deepest scar of all. The day of my husband's funeral, when the man who should have protected me, my brother-in-law, showed me the ugliest truth about family. It was late autumn, the kind where the air feels thin and sharp, where the trees stand bare as bones and the ground crunches underfoot with frost. The church bell rang slow and mournful, though I barely heard it through the ringing in my ears. My husband, Henry, lay in the casket at the front of the sanctuary, hands folded neatly as if in prayer. He had been my partner for 43 years. My anchor, my constant. Now he was gone. The pews were full. Neighbors, colleagues, distant relatives, all murmuring their condolences, all speaking in hushed tones as though grief could be softened if handled delicately. I sat in the front row with my children and grandchildren, my black gloves twisting in my lap. My chest ached with that hollow, crushing weight of loss that makes every breath feel like labor. And then there was Charles, Henry's younger brother, the one who had charmed his way through life, always smiling, always shaking hands, always being described as so dependable. To the outside world, Charles was kindness embodied. To me, he had always been a shadow lingering at the edges. Too many lingering stares. Too many times he stood too close when Henry wasn't looking. But I had never had reason or courage to voice it. That day at the funeral, he played his part perfectly. He hugged the guests, dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, kissed me on the cheek in front of everyone, whispering, "We'll take care of you now, Maggie. You're not alone." The crowd nodded approvingly at his display of brotherly devotion. I forced a weak smile, though his lips had lingered just a second too long on my skin. After the service, we filed out to the cemetery. The wind cut through my black coat as I stood at the graveside, clutching a rose until the thorns bit into my palm. One by one, family and friends dropped flowers onto the coffin, the dull thud echoing in my chest. My children were weeping, my grandchildren clung to their parents, and I stood there numb, staring at the dirt that would soon cover the man I had loved for most of my life. When the final prayer was said, the mourners dispersed slowly, their shoes crunching across the gravel. People murmured promises. "Call if you need anything. We'll check in soon," promises I knew would fade with time. Grief has a way of thinning the crowd, leaving only the echoes. As twilight settled, I lingered at the grave long after most had left. My children had gone ahead to the reception hall, taking the grandchildren with them. The cemetery grew quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. That was when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned and found Charles standing there, his face solemn, his black coat buttoned tight. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said softly, though his hand didn't leave my shoulder. "Henry wouldn't want that." "I just need a moment," I whispered, my voice raw. "I'll give you as long as you need," he replied, though he didn't step away. His hand squeezed slightly, lingering again. Too long, too familiar. I stiffened but said nothing. My mind was too clouded with grief to process anything clearly. He guided me gently away from the grave, his arm brushing mine as though it were natural. But it wasn't natural. Nothing about it was. At the reception hall, people gathered around tables, sipping coffee, nibbling on sandwiches, sharing memories of Henry. Laughter even broke through now and then, soft and tentative, the way people laugh at funerals because they don't know what else to do. I sat in the corner, nodding as stories washed over me, though I barely heard a word. Charles hovered. He fetched me a drink. He shooed away well-meaning guests who tried to engage me. He positioned himself at my side as though he were my protector. But the weight of his presence was not comforting. It was suffocating. When the crowd finally thinned and the hall emptied, I gathered my purse and coat, ready to leave. My children were taking the grandchildren home, promising to check on me in the morning. I walked slowly toward the exit, my body heavy with exhaustion. "Let me drive you," Charles offered, his hand already at my elbow. "I can manage," I said, forcing a smile. "It's only a few minutes." But he insisted. "Henry would want me to make sure you're safe." I was too tired to argue. I let him lead me to his car, the leather seats cold against my legs. The ride was short, quiet, the air thick with unspoken words. When we arrived at my house, he insisted again. "Let me walk you in." The house was dark, hollow without Henry's presence. I stepped inside, setting my purse on the table, shrugging off my coat. Charles followed, closing the door behind him. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said, his voice low. "It's too soon. Too raw." "I'll be all right," I murmured. "Thank you for the ride." But he didn't leave. He stepped closer, his eyes catching the dim light, something unreadable flickering there. Before I could process it, his hand brushed against mine, lingering, sliding upward in a way that made my stomach twist. Froze. "Charles," I whispered, my throat tightening. "What are you doing?" He smiled faintly, that same charming smile the world always believed. "Taking care of you, Maggie. Like I promised." The words made my blood run cold. I stepped back, but his hand caught my wrist. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing in, my pulse thundering in my ears. In that moment, after the funeral, after burying my husband, after enduring the condolences and the hollow words, I realized that my grief had left me vulnerable. And Charles had been waiting. Hang on, before I tell you what happened next, make sure you've subscribed and left your thoughts in the comments. This part gets intense. When people talk about family, they like to dress it up in warm words. Support, loyalty, love. But families, like houses, don't always fall in a single storm. Sometimes the rot starts deep inside the beams, slow and quiet, until one day the whole structure caves in. Looking back, I can see the rot had been there for years. Henry and I married young. He was steady, dependable, the kind of man who kept his word and looked you in the eye when he spoke. He worked long days at the mill, came home smelling of cedar and iron, and still managed to read bedtime stories to the children. He wasn't perfect. He had his temper, his pride, but he was mine, and for over 40 years that was enough. Then there was Charles, Henry's younger brother by 6 years, and from the start, people said he was the charmer of the family. Where Henry was solid, Charles was smooth. He knew how to tell a joke that made a whole room laugh, how to shake hands with a smile that made men trust him, how to compliment a woman just enough to make her blush. The world loved Charles. And that was the problem. Because behind closed doors, his charm was a mask. I saw it early. At our wedding, when I was still in my dress, he leaned too close during a dance and whispered, "If Henry ever gets tired of you, you know where to find me." He grinned like it was a joke, but the chill it left in my stomach stayed with me long after the music stopped. When I told Henry later, he brushed it off. "That's just Charles. He doesn't mean anything by it." That became the refrain of my life. That's just Charles. When he stood too close in the kitchen at family gatherings, brushing against my arm, it was "That's just Charles." When his hand lingered a second too long on my back when no one was looking, it was "That's just Charles." When he made jokes with double meanings, his eyes flicking to mine while the others laughed, it was "That's just Charles." At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I read too much into his words, his touches. He never crossed a clear line, not one that could be pointed to without sounding paranoid. He was too clever for that. And Henry trusted him. He saw Charles as his brother, his blood, the one who had his back since childhood. In Henry's eyes, Charles could do no wrong. To accuse him of something would have felt like accusing Henry himself of being blind. So I kept quiet. That silence cost me. Over the years, Charles carved out his role in the family as the helper. If Henry needed a hand fixing the roof, Charles was there. If one of the kids needed picking up, Charles volunteered. He made himself indispensable, always showing up with that same charming smile. And with every favor, every gesture of brotherly devotion, the family's trust in him grew. Meanwhile, my unease grew too. There were moments I can still see clearly. One Thanksgiving, I was washing dishes alone when he slipped into the kitchen. He stood behind me, close enough that I felt his breath on my neck. "You know, Maggie," he murmured, "Henry doesn't know how lucky he is." His hand brushed my waist before I twisted away, nearly dropping a plate. When I told Henry later, his laugh was dismissive. "You take everything too seriously." Another time at a summer cookout, I went inside to fetch more lemonade. Charles followed. I bent to grab the pitcher from the fridge, and when I turned, he was blocking the doorway, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin crawl. He stepped aside eventually, with a grin and a wink. When I told my sister-in-law, she shook her head. "Oh, Charles flirts with everyone. It's harmless." Harmless. That was the word people clung to. The word that excused every little violation, every look, every touch. It was easier for them to believe Charles was harmless than to face what it really was. Over the years, that silence became a prison. I learned to avoid being alone with him. I kept a careful distance, always making sure someone else was in the room. I thought that if I could just endure it, if I could just keep my boundaries, it would never go further. But Henry's death changed everything. The moment the coffin was lowered, Charles saw his opportunity. Without Henry, I was vulnerable. Without Henry, there was no buffer, no shield, no reason for him to hold back. And the family, they adored Charles too much to believe anything against him. They had seen his loyalty, his charm, his endless helpfulness. To them, he was the man who showed up. The man who could do no wrong. So, when he put his hand on my wrist in that dark house after the funeral, when he looked at me with that same smile the world thought was kindness, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't new. This wasn't grief making him act out. This had been building for decades. And now, with Henry gone, there was nothing, and no one, standing in his way. Before we move on, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear what you think so far. The night of Henry's funeral is a blur of black coats, hushed voices, and the weight of grief pressing so heavy on my chest I could barely breathe. But there is one moment I remember with cruel clarity. The moment my brother-in-law, Charles, stepped across a line I had spent decades trying to guard. After the reception, when the mourners had gone, he insisted on driving me home. I told myself it was kindness, that perhaps I was imagining the wrongness in his touch on my arm, the lingering looks. But deep down I knew better. When we entered the house, the silence was suffocating. Every corner of that home felt hollow without Henry. The ticking clock on the mantel sounded like thunder in the stillness. I set my purse down on the table, my hands trembling, my body so tired it felt borrowed. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," Charles said softly, closing the door behind him. His coat hung open, his tie loosened. He looked at me not with grief, but with possession. "I'll be fine," I whispered. "Thank you for the ride. You can go now." But he didn't. He stepped closer. His hand brushed mine, slid higher along my wrist, gripping gently but firmly. My stomach twisted. "Charles," I said, pulling back. "Please. Don't." He smiled, that same easy smile he used on the world. "You've been through so much. You need someone to take care of you now." I shook my head, stepping back, my heel catching the rug. "That's not your place." He moved forward anyway. His hand caught my arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to let me know he wasn't letting me go. "It's just us now, Maggie," he murmured. "Henry's gone. You don't have to be alone." His words sliced through me. Henry's gone. As if his death was an open invitation. As if grief was a doorway he had been waiting to walk through all along. I tried to pull free. Stop this. Let me go. His grip tightened. Don't fight me, he whispered. You'll see I'm right. You'll see I can give you what he can't anymore. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I shoved against his chest, but he was stronger. He pressed closer, his breath hot against my cheek. Charles! My voice cracked. Don't you dare! But he did. The details blur. His hands, the weight of his body, the way the room spun as my grief turned to terror. I remember the sickening realization that no one would walk through the door to stop him. Henry was gone. My children were gone. I was alone with him. When it was over, I curled on the rug, clutching my arms around myself, my body shaking so violently my teeth chattered. Charles stood above me, adjusting his tie as if nothing had happened. He knelt, brushing my hair back from my face. His voice was calm, casual, as though he had done me a favor. You'll feel better soon. Don't dwell on it. Best to let it go. Let it go. The words lodged in me like glass. Then he left. Just like that. He closed the door behind him, leaving me in the silence of a house that no longer felt like mine. I lay there for hours, numb, broken, staring at the ceiling until dawn crept through the curtains. When my children came by in the morning to check on me, I plastered on a brittle smile, too ashamed to speak, too raw to explain. But eventually I told them. I told my daughter first. Her face went pale, her hand flying to her mouth. Then she said, Mom, are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood. Uncle Charles has been so good to us. Maybe he was just trying to comfort you. Comfort. That's what she called it. When I told my son, his expression hardened. This isn't the time for drama, Mom. I just died. Don't tear the family apart over something you think happened. Let it go. Let it go. Again. I tried to speak to Henry's sister. She shook her head, eyes wide. Maggie, Charles. He's always been a good man. He helped us so much after Henry passed. Don't start this now. It will ruin everything. Ruin everything. As if the ruin wasn't already inside me. Finally, I sat with my eldest daughter, hoping she would believe me. But she only squeezed my hand gently and whispered, Mom, you've been under so much stress. Maybe it's your grief talking. Don't make accusations you can't take back. One by one they turned from me. My own children. My own family. They didn't want the truth. They wanted peace. And so they gave me silence. I spent weeks in that silence. I stopped eating. I stopped sleeping. Every room in the house felt haunted, not by Henry, but by Charles's shadow. When the phone rang, when a knock came at the door, I froze, afraid it would be him again. But worse than my fear was the crushing loneliness of not being believed. To be hurt is one thing. To be told it never happened, to be told to let it go, is another wound entirely. I thought of ending it all more than once. I thought of joining Henry in the earth, of leaving the silence behind. But then I thought of my grandchildren, their little faces, their tiny hands clutching mine at the funeral. I couldn't leave them. I couldn't let Charles win. So I stayed. And slowly, as the grief hardened into something sharper, I realized that silence would never protect me. Silence was the very thing that had allowed Charles to thrive all these years. If no one would give me a voice, I would have to carve one out myself. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But I knew this. The next time my family heard my voice, it would not be in whispers. It would be in a room where they could not turn away. And when that day came, they would listen. Before we go any further, click subscribe and let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? Grief doesn't leave overnight. Neither does shame. For weeks after that night, I carried both like twin weights pressing down on my shoulders. I moved through the house in silence, avoiding mirrors, avoiding memories. Charles's voice echoed in my head. Don't dwell on it. Let it go. And my family's voices layered on top of his, urging the same. But the thing about silence is that it grows heavy. And eventually silence breaks. I remember one evening, sitting at the kitchen table, the sun sinking low and casting long shadows across the floor. I had my mother's old Bible in front of me, though I wasn't reading. I just stared at it, hollow. That's when a thought, sharp and clear, slipped into my mind. They want me quiet because my voice scares them. Startled me. But it was true. Charles had thrived in the silence of this family for years. People excused him, ignored the hints, laughed off the discomfort. And now, when he had finally crossed the line, that same silence was protecting him again. If I stayed quiet, nothing would change. He would keep his reputation. He would keep his power. He would keep smirking at me across family gatherings, knowing no one would believe me. But if I spoke, if I chose the right moment, the right place, the silence would shatter. Began to plan. The first step was observation. Charles carried himself as though nothing had happened. At the next family gathering, a Sunday dinner, he laughed loudly, told stories, poured drinks. He even made a show of pulling out a chair for me, his hand brushing the back of mine as if daring me to flinch. I held myself still, my face carefully blank. I noticed how the others looked at him. Admiration, gratitude, pendants. He was the man they leaned on, especially now that Henry was gone. He had made himself indispensable, handling Henry's accounts, advising on the estate, smoothing over arguments. And that's when I realized. The estate. Henry had left behind property, savings, and heirlooms that would eventually be divided. The reading of the will was set to happen at the family estate hall, a place steeped in legacy and importance. Everyone would be there. The children, the grandchildren, the cousins, the in-laws. It would be Charles's stage to shine, to play the role of dutiful brother, the one keeping everything together. It would also be the perfect place to destroy him. The second step was preparation. I wrote everything down. Every moment from that night. The smell of his cologne, the grip of his hand on my wrist, the words he whispered. I wrote down the smaller moments too. The stares, the brushes, the jokes over the years that I had been told to dismiss. I filled page after page in a notebook, my handwriting shaking but steadying as I went. I knew some would still doubt me. I knew words on a page wouldn't be enough for everyone, but they would be enough for me. And if I read them aloud in front of the entire family, with no room to interrupt, no space to walk away, they would have no choice but to hear me. The third step was finding my strength. I started small. I walked every morning, breathing deep, letting the cold air fill my lungs until I felt alive again. I looked at myself in the mirror and said the words I had written. First my voice cracked, but slowly it grew steadier. You hurt me, Charles. You thought silence would protect you. But today I'm speaking. I said it over and over until I could imagine the words echoing in the estate hall. Until I could see his smirk faltering, his mask slipping. The fourth step was secrecy. Told no one. Not my daughter, not my son, not even my closest friend. They had already told me to let it go. I would not give them the chance to silence me again before I was ready. The letter from the lawyer arrived. The reading of the will was set for the following month. My heart pounded as I read the date. That was it. That was my day. I tucked my notebook into the lining of my purse, hiding it under scarves and tissues. Every night, I took it out and read it again, refining the words, sharpening them into something undeniable. I did not sleep much those weeks. But for the first time since Henry's death, my sleeplessness was not hollow. It was purposeful. The fifth step was resolve. On the morning of the inheritance reading, I stood in front of the mirror in my black dress, the same one I had worn to Henry's funeral. My hands trembled as I adjusted the collar. The woman staring back at me looked older than I remembered, lines deeper, eyes harder. But there was something else too, a steadiness. "You don't have to be loud," I whispered to my reflection. "You only have to be clear." When I slipped the notebook into my purse, I felt its weight like armor. I knew the risks. I knew some would still choose to protect Charles, to accuse me of bitterness or madness. But I also knew this. Once I spoke, there would be no going back to silence. And I was ready for that. As I walked out the door, the winter wind whipping against my face, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For months I had been suffocating under grief and fear. But now, with the estate hall waiting with my words ready, I finally felt like I was breathing again. Charles had used my silence as his weapon. But silence was about to end. Real quick, subscribe and share your thoughts below before we get to the part that still makes my heart race. The Turner Estate Hall was a room built for pride. High ceilings, polished oak tables, walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Every gathering there carried the weight of legacy, of money and name and appearances. It was where Henry's father had announced business deals, where engagements were toasted, where every new generation was paraded before the old. That morning, the family gathered for the reading of Henry's will. My children, my grandchildren, cousins I hadn't seen in years, all sat in rows of chairs facing the long table at the front, where the lawyer arranged his papers with slow precision. And there, near the head of the room, sat Charles. His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back. His face wore that same mask of solemn dignity he had carried at the funeral, as if grief had made him noble. He shook hands, patted shoulders, spoke in low tones about Henry's legacy. To anyone watching, he was the very picture of loyalty, the brother carrying the burden of responsibility. But when his eyes met mine across the room, his smile sharpened. Just for a second, a smile no one else would notice. A smile that said, "You wouldn't dare." My hand tightened around the strap of my purse, feeling the notebook inside. I sat quietly as the lawyer began. He read Henry's words in a steady voice. Accounts divided among the children, heirlooms passed down, property to be managed fairly. My children leaned in, listening closely. My grandchildren fidgeted. The air hummed with tension as every detail of legacy was spoken into being. When the lawyer finished, the room exhaled. Murmurs rose, chairs shifted. That was meant to be the end. But I stood. The scrape of my chair echoed too loudly in the quiet hall. Heads turned. Eyes blinked. Charles froze, his smile faltering. "I need to speak," I said. My voice was clear, steady, louder than I expected. "Before we leave this room, there's something you all need to hear." The lawyer hesitated, looking uncertain. My son frowned. "Mom, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I cut in, my eyes fixed on Charles. The room stilled. I reached into my purse and pulled out the notebook. My hands didn't shake. Not anymore. I opened to the first page and looked directly at my family. My children, my grandchildren, cousins, nieces, nephews. "This family is built on legacy," I began. "On the stories we tell about who we are. But there is a truth you have all ignored. A truth I will no longer carry alone." I let the silence stretch before I spoke again. After Henry's funeral, when my grief was raw, when I was at my weakest, Charles came to my home. He did not come to comfort. He came to take advantage. He put his hands on me against my will. He violated me. And when I tried to tell you, when I begged you to listen, you told me to let it go. Gasps rippled across the room. My daughter's face went white. My son's mouth opened, then shut. Whispers broke out among the cousins. Charles shot to his feet, his mask cracking. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice trembling with anger. "She's confused. She's grieving. She doesn't know what she's saying." But I raised the notebook higher. I wrote it all down. Every word, every touch, every time he lingered when no one else was looking. I've carried it for decades, the things you all excused with. That's just Charles. But I will not excuse it anymore. I read from the page. My voice didn't waver. The details spilled into the air. The whispers, the stares, the hand on my waist in kitchens and doorways, the jokes with double meanings, and finally, the night after Henry's funeral when his mask came off entirely. The room was silent except for my voice. Even the children sat still, sensing the gravity. Charles tried to interrupt, but the lawyer raised a hand sharply. "Let her finish," he said, his voice low but firm. When I reached the last page, I closed the notebook slowly. My eyes scanned the room. Faces I had known my whole life now looked different. Pale, shocked, unsettled. "This is my truth," I said. "You told me to let it go. You told me it would ruin the family. But what ruins a family is not speaking the truth. What ruins a family is silence." I turned to Charles. His face was red, his jaw clenched, his fists curled at his sides. "You have hidden behind charm and reputation your whole life. But today, in this hall where you thought your name gave you power, everyone has heard what you really are." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Turner, do you wish for this to be entered into record?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I want it written down where it cannot be erased." Charles erupted. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You've all known me my whole life. You know I would never." But the room didn't rise to defend him. My eldest daughter stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. My son buried his face in his hands. Cousins shook their heads. A niece whispered, "I always felt uneasy around him." The silence was no longer my prison. It was his. I stepped closer, my voice quiet now, but every word cut like glass. "You told me to let it go, Charles. But I didn't. I made you listen." The hall erupted then, not in applause but in voices rising all at once. Questions. Accusations. Charles tried to push through, but people stepped back from him as though his touch might burn. His mask, his charm, his years of control, gone in a single morning. When he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, the air felt lighter than it had in decades. I stood there, my notebook still in my hand, my breath coming slow and steady. My children didn't rush to me. They didn't embrace me. They sat in silence, processing, shame on their faces for the years they hadn't listened. But that was all right, because this wasn't about their approval. It was about my voice. And after years of being told to be quiet, my voice had finally filled the room. They told me to let it go, to stay quiet for the sake of family peace. But silence is what let him thrive. Silence is what nearly broke me. The day I finally spoke in front of everyone, his mask shattered and his power ended. You cannot build a family on silence, but you can rebuild one on truth. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Share these stories so more voices are heard, because the louder we speak, the harder it is for anyone to be silenced again.